Welcome to our July PVFF Beginner's Fly Tying instruction. Now today we're going to be learning a new fly, and it is referred to as Pat's Rubber Legs. Pat's Rubber Legs is named after the developer or innovator of this fly, Pat Bennett, who was a guide on one of the western rivers. His fly, again, Pat's Rubber Legs, was an adaptation of a much earlier fly, stonefly imitation referred to as the girdle bug. It consists of relatively simple materials, and the tying steps are basically very simple. However, the difficult thing in tying Pat's Rubber Legs is to be able to manage the rubber appendages. That would be the legs, the tail, and the antennae. So what I'm going to be showing today is my adaptation of Pat's Rubber Legs from the various patterns to imitate this fly that I found on the internet. Most of those were, the fly has 6 legs. But in order to manage effectively the number of appendages that are on this fly, I decided to reduce the number of legs to 4, make it much easier. And I don't believe that fish can count and determine that there's a difference between 4 and 6-legged fly. So we'll get started in a few minutes, but today's goals are for the tyers to learn new techniques for attaching legs and tails or any material that's used as an appendage that's made out of rubber or rubber-like material. And also one of my goals today is to provide you with a simple imitation of a stonefly nymph, and to provide a fly that has been proven very effective for fishing streams and rivers, particularly in the West, but not to be exclusively western rivers, because this fly would be very effective anywhere there's stoneflies or anywhere that there are nymphs that might mimic a stonefly. This fly also provides you with one more large nymph in your collection that should be effective for fishing for smallmouth bass and is known to be effective in fishing for carp. So let's get on with today's instruction. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the materials. We are going to be using lead wire, which I will hold up. Lead wire, and this is 0.015. So this fly is generally tied with lead wire along the shank of the hook, either of that diameter or slightly larger, and that would be 0.0. We'll be using 6/0 thread. I'm going to be using a brown 6/0 thread, which pretty much corresponds to the color of the abdomen of the fly. We're going to be using elastic legs, and I will show you what these legs are. These are silicone legs that I have purchased from the Fly Shack. And in particular, the color that I'm using is called brown with gold flake on it. Most all of the imitations of this Pat's Rubber Legs that I have found, it's recommended that you tie them in the color of a brown stonefly that would be prevalent on some of the western rivers, and most of those are brown, okay? And then we're going to be using New Age chenille, which again is in a brown with a flake in it. And so those are the sort of recommended colors that I found on researching this fly on the internet. I'm going to be using also a size 8 streamer hook. So this fly can also be tied with a stonefly hook, and many of the patterns that imitate this on the internet will show you, or will be tied with a stonefly hook, but a streamer hook is the preferred. So those are the materials we're going to be using. Now, you can, in fact, mix the colors to develop your own particular species, so to speak, of this patch rubber legs, but all of my research on the internet is that the preferred colors would include a gold or a brown or something of that nature. But there's no harm in tying this in black with some sparkle in or something like that. In fact, one of the tyers recommended to tie plenty of brown and tan patterns to fish when dark stoneflies are working well. All right, well, let's begin to tie this fly. I've already placed in the vise a size 8 streamer hook. Again, this is a 7040 made by the Sabre Company, which I purchased from the Fly Shack. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is, and I want to point out something right at the very beginning, and I'll point to it with my pliers. You notice that right here along the side of the head of my vise, I have attached a small rubber band. And I suggest that you use this technique, which I'll demonstrate as you begin to tie, by putting a small rubber band around the head of your vise. And that's basically going to be used to hold some of these wiggly legs in place while we're tying on the forward part of the fly. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is put some of this 015 lead on the hook that I've already placed in the vise. And I will begin just slightly halfway beyond the midpoint and wrap this lead wire on, of course moving forward with it, so that I'm covering about a total of 1/2 of the shank of the hook. A few more wraps, and then just helicopter that off that end and do the same thing at the back end. Now this provides enough weight to the fly in order to take it down. I had given some thought to using a heavier lead wire, but then I realized that we want to maintain the silhouette of a narrow stonefly, so we don't want bulky lead wire in here. And that's probably the reason why it's recommended to use 0.015 to 0.020 lead wraps. Notice the next thing that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be starting my thread behind the lead, and the reason is because I want to create a block, so to speak, or somewhat of a dam that's going to keep the lead wrap from moving back on the shank. Then I wrap forward over the lead till I get in front, and then I do much the same thing immediately in front of that lead to create a block, or again I'll refer to it as a dam in front, and it also presents somewhat of a taper. Now I can come back to the rear of the fly and stop just about where I initially tied in the thread. All right, the next thing we're going to be doing is putting on the tail of the fly. And there are various ways of doing this, and this rubber material is sometimes a little difficult to work with. So the method that I'm going to describe to you is as follows. I take my thread wraps back the bend of the hook just about where the barb is, and I have my thread hanging there. I hold this piece of the rubber leg material along my side of the hook, and I make several thread wraps just to get this started on my side. And then I wrap it forward, several more wraps. This rubber material is relatively difficult to work with, so I'm trying to pass along some tips to you that I've come to use in tying this fly and several others. At this point I have the tail tied on my side, and the long part of this rubber is still sticking forward. I now lift this over to the far side of the hook, and begin to make wraps back towards the tail while holding, back towards the bend of the hook while holding the material on the far side. And that looks pretty good. Now I'm bringing a few more wraps forward. And then I'm going to clip off some of this, but not all of it. Right now I have about 1 inch or so of tail material tied on each side. Now at this point I can also put a drop of cement on the fly back here just to hold things in place. Next I will take a piece of the chenille that I've chosen, and as I mentioned before, this is referred to as dark chocolate by the Fly Shack. Stripping off a little bit of material from the end of the chenille and catching those few little strands, making some wraps back. Now, as I probably already mentioned, there's various YouTube videos on the internet that show the different ways of tying this. I prefer this method, particularly for a beginner's class, because some of the techniques that you'll find on the internet are relatively difficult to accomplish at the beginner stage. And so I have sort of refined and taken what I would refer to as the best of the group that I looked at, all of which is going to turn out to give us pretty much the same looking fly. Now notice the next thing I do, I have the tail, this chenille tied in. I bring my thread just slightly more than halfway forward on the shank of the hook, and I stop just about there. I'm going to do 1 half hitch just to hold my thread in place at that point. And now I can pull my thread out of the way while I wrap the chenille forward. Till I get right to the point where the thread is hanging. Make 1 wrap over the chenille to hold it in place, and then a wrap in front of it. Now the chenille is back out of the way. So the next thing I will do is tie in rubber legs on my side and then on the far side. And the way that I do this is I take this length of rubber leg material and I wrap it once around the thread, and I'll just hold this up so that it's easier for you to see it as it's being filmed by the camera. So this leg is wrapped once around the thread. I just hold that to the near side of the fly, make 1 wrap again, and now you can see that leg is temporarily fastened to this side of the fly. You can adjust that later on because this material will still swing around the fly, so to speak, a little bit in order to adjust it so that it is sticking out both sides. Now I take another corresponding piece for the far side, wrap it around the thread, lift it over, slide it down the thread, and now it's basically in place. 1 or 2 more thread wraps at that point, and then I can pull those legs back, bring the thread forward, stopping about 1/8 of an inch in front of the eye of the hook. And I'm going to make another half hitch there. Just to hold my thread in place. Okay. Now the legs, the tail's on. We've started the body. The legs are tied in on left and right. I'm taking the chenille now between the rear legs and the front legs. 1 wrap. and then coming around and going in front of. I'm going to be holding back these two legs, making this wrap forward. Actually, it took me 2 wraps to get there. And now I hope that you can see that what I've done is I've made 2 wraps in front of the legs. I still have some space to finish off the head of the fly. So I'm going to lock that in place with 1 more thread wrap. And then in front. And then I'm clipping off this chenille. I no longer need any more chenille. Okay, we're getting close to the completion now. You might ask, well, why did I put the rubber band on the head of the vise? I've slipped that up over the abdomen of the fly to hold the rubber legs back in place while I'm tying on the last part of the fly, and that would be the appendages, the antenna appendages. All right, so as we did in the last several moments, we're going to take the last piece of rubber leg, wrap it around the thread, hold it up on top of the hook, make 1 or 2 wraps, which is anchoring it at the top. And now we have to be able to secure it in place. And I'm going to be using, which is basically an X wrap. So this is what I just completed was making 1 wrap around to hold the rubber in place, and that's what we refer to as an X wrap, going from the back to the front, coming underneath, going from the front to the back. Now, we're almost finished, and what I want to do is make several wraps, kind of adjusting this so that these 2 antennae are facing forward. Wraps like so. I'm going to clip this off evenly. And the length of the antenna and the tail should be about half the shank length. So this is just a little bit too long. Clip off a little bit more. And then I can take my whip finisher and just make a few more wraps right there. And fly is basically finished. You can slip off the rubber band. Now the next thing I'm going to do, which we're almost finished, is I'm going to adjust the legs on each side. I want to make sure that the tail is uniform. The tail also should be about half the shank length. So clip a little bit of that off. And I can take the 4 legs, pull them up together on the very top of the fly. Have all 4 in place and clip them off at about the length of the shank of the hook. And this one slipped and it's just a little bit too long. Now 1 more step and then we are finished. And that is, stoneflies are flat in shape. They're broad and they're flat. So we want to trim a little bit of this chenille off the top. And off the bottom. And our fly is just about finished. Okay, there we have patch rubber legs, stonefly imitation. All right, so we've just completed tying one of these patch rubber legs, stonefly imitations. So I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about some recommendations about the tying of the flies and about the fishing with patch rubber legs imitation. So the one internet site that I looked at said to tie plenty of the brown and tan patterns when fishing, particularly when there's dark stoneflies hatching. But the other thing that I found interesting is that the recommendation was to use green or a mottled green to give the fly some additional versatility. In other words, you're not only going to have one color to work with, but you are going to have another one to go to, which perhaps the fish might prefer on a particular stream or river that you're fishing. The recommendation was to go to a smaller hook size if you're going to also try another color, such as green, which the author of that particular article said worked really well for grass carp that key on green things, obviously things that are growing in the vegetation where the carp are feeding. Now, another recommendation was to not put a heavy lead core on the fly, but rather let it suspend or sink very slowly by putting just a modest amount of lead on the shank of the hook. So if you're fishing for other species other than trout, you might want to consider lightening up a little bit on the amount of lead that's on the fly. Some of the other authors of this fly or tyers of this fly will put a bead head on the front of it. And not necessarily a shiny bead head, but one that's basically just going to give a little bit more movement to the fly. Not necessarily making an attractor type of pattern. And heavily weighted, it can be also fished late in the season as a down terrestrial, so somewhat a dead terrestrial rather than a live stonefly, that type of thing. Now, how would I fish this fly? Well, like with any flies that have rubber legs, what is the purpose of those rubber legs? It's to give the fly some action, to make it look alive. And so a slow, sort of tantalizing, undulating motion in the retrieve, when mixed with the river currents, is going to bring this fly to life and make it very effective as an attractor pattern. Now, like its predecessors to patch rubber legs, this fly is all about how prolific it is and the color of the insects in that particular body of water, that stream or that river. And so the rubber legs, not only the body of the fly, what I'm saying, the body of the fly is what will get the fish's attention, but the legs on the fly is what really makes it lifelike. So you can fish this fly in a double fly rig with the patch rubber legs as the top fly in a double nymph fly rig, and use it as a prospecting pattern to get the fish's attention. Or you can fish it as a dropper on a dry dropper rig, especially when stoneflies are hatching, and you might use something like a stimulator or a seducer or some other large stonefly as your lead fly, and particularly if the water's a little bit off color. Well, what else can I tell you about it? Trout are more inclined to eat this fly when it's well presented, with a drag-free drift, rather than just trying to replicate what looks good in your hand or in the fly tyer's hand, but not so great as it looks to the trout itself. So it's the presentation that we want to focus on. And in reading a number of articles about the use of this fly, on many of the western rivers at least, it's a go-to fly when nothing else is working, because it imitates a natural food form that they are used to seeing. So it's not just attracting them, it's basically simulating something that they're used to. So the take-home message here is this is a relatively simple-looking fly, but never underestimate the power of a good, simple, ugly fly, because in some people's eyes, this is an ugly fly, but I'm sure that thousands of fish that have been caught with it, it didn't look just ugly, it looked good to eat. So I hope that you learned something today, and I hope that the instruction will be helpful to you to tie your version of Pat's rubber legs. Thank you. And tight lines.